What's up, folks? Welcome back to the Whoop podcast. I'm your host, Will Ahmed, founder and CEO of Whoop, and we are on a mission to unlock human performance. This week's episode, Whoop VP of Performance Science, our principal scientist, your favorite, Kristen Holmes, is joined by Dr. Alexandra Solomon, a couples therapist, speaker, author, and professor. Dr. Solomon is passionate about translating cutting-edge research and clinical wisdom into practical tools people can use to bring awareness, curiosity, and authenticity to their relationships. Dr. Solomon is an award-winning author of 2 books, Taking Sexy Back and Loving Bravely, and her work has been featured in the Oprah magazine, Vogue, the New York Times, and more. But today she is here to discuss her latest book that was just released, Love Every Day. Kristen and Alexandra discuss what it means to have relational self-awareness, having conversations about boundaries with yourself and others, steps to get back into dating after a relationship or difficult experience. She talks about the positives and negatives of being on dating apps, what to look for in a potential partner on the first date, solving problems with your partner in a relationship, the teachings from her new book, Love Every Day. She talks about daily tips and micro practices you can do to be a better partner, and sex in a relationship and in the dating world. She emphasizes the importance of knowing what is best for yourself and then communicating that to your partner. Thinking about joining Whoop? You can now join for free. Sign up for a free 30-day trial. Enjoy the full Whoop experience, hardware, software, everything, and that is at whoop.com. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@whoop.com, call us 508-443-4952, and we will answer your questions on a future episode. Without further ado, here are Kristen Holmes and Dr. Alexandra Solomon.
Dr. Alexandra Solomon is internationally recognized as one of today's most trusted voices in the world of relationships, and her framework of relational self-awareness has reached millions of people around the globe. She is on faculty in the School of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University, go Big Ten, and is a licensed clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. Her hit podcast, which I recommend everyone check out, is called Reimagining Love, and that reaches tens of thousands of listeners around the world each week and features high-profile guests from a variety of domains: therapy, academia, and pop culture. Dr. Solomon is an award-winning author of 2 books, Taking Sexy Back and Loving Bravely, which was featured on the Today Show. And her newest book, which we'll talk a little bit about today, Love Every Day, just came out this month. And we're just really excited to dig into all things relationships. Dr. Solomon, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I want to start off by defining this kind of concept, relational self-awareness, and just really unpack, what exactly is its value, why is it important, and how do we think about it in the context of our daily life?
Wonderful. Yeah. So I've worn a lot of different hats in my career. Some of my time is spent being a couples therapist, an individual therapist. Some of my time is spent training therapists and teaching undergrad students about relationships. And some of my time is spent translating academic literature, clinical wisdom to the public domain. I love being a sort of public-facing relationship educator. But what I've realized is the through line between all those aspects of my career, as well as my status as a wife, long time, in a long time marriage, is what I'm always doing is helping people, helping myself understand and unpack our relationship to relationships. So this idea that self-reflection, looking inward at what's going on inside of us, and intimacy, looking at what's happening in the space between us, are so bound up together. They're inseparable from each other. But the challenge is, especially in an intimate relationship, it's so easy to get focused on what the other person is doing. It's so easy to get focused on, if you would just do less of this and more of this, we wouldn't have these problems. So the idea of relational self-awareness is that it's an ongoing commitment to becoming students of ourselves, students of our own reactivity, not in the service of blaming ourselves for our relationship problems, but in the service of always keeping ourselves in the ring, always keeping ourselves in the equation. So what I call the golden equation of love is my stuff plus your stuff equals our stuff. Everything that happens in our intimate relationships. And we can bring relational self-awareness to our parenting, to our friendships, to our colleague relationships. But the heart of my work is really studying intimate relationships. But everything is my stuff plus your stuff equals our stuff. It's the choreography, it's the dances, it's the patterns, it's the cycles. And so relational self-awareness is a set of tools and frameworks and perspectives that we can use to get to know ourselves better so that we can show up more fully with more savvy around looking at the dynamics that are happening between ourselves and the people that we love.
Beautiful. What would you say are some of the foundational elements that enable relational self awareness? So, if we're kind of thinking about what are some of the things that I can control daily outside of my
Mhm.
relationships that allow me to come into this kind of conversation, this choreography in a way that really enables me to kind of show up as my kind of fullest version?
Yeah. A lot of my time is spent helping people understand their early experiences, the ways in which the past travels with us, looking at our families of
Mm,
origin, the family systems that we grew up in that I refer to as our original love classrooms. When we're little, we're
mm,
taking in all kinds of messages about how to do relationships, both in terms of how
mm,
we are treated as well as what we observe. So a lot of the work is that kind of big picture, understanding what's been passed on through our family tree and that lives inside of us. Not, I'm never here for throwing parents under the bus. I am a parent myself. In fact, I'm a parent of emerging adults. So I'm in that chapter
mm,
of needing to be accountable for the ways in which my kids have, felt moments of misunderstanding or moments of frustration with
mm,
me. It's all of that. So it's not about throwing parents under the bus, but that's kind of the big picture work. But I think what you're getting at, Kristen, is also what do we do each day? And so I think that
mm,
kind of like big picture life review, studying the family that we grew up in, I think that sits alongside the daily practices around sleep and
mm,
nutrition and movement and mindfulness and all of that, because that does show up. It's very, very difficult to extend more grace to our intimate partner than we are extending to ourselves. I know that when I'm running on empty, when I am feeling self critical, I know that I am more sensitive to my husband's words. I am more sensitive to hearing something that is probably neutral from his perspective, hearing it as a critique of myself because I've been doing that to myself. So I think there are both like those big ideas about looking at our family systems and then these smaller, more micro ideas of how are we caring for ourselves day by day, because that does the daily care of myself has a profound impact on my relationship.
wow, yeah, there's a lot there. So we have a lot of members on our platform are kind of service archetypes, and and I think that they're kind of going down this journey where they know, gosh, I need to take care of myself, for my patients or for just being able to do just a really hard job. So we've got a lot of shift workers on our platform.
Mm,
But I think with that archetype, you've got people who kind of see taking care of themselves as a little selfish. It's just not, they're always extending first. But
mhm.
as a result, they end up, their kind of capacity or their demands exceed their capacity. What would be just your recommendation on just how to, again, kind of think about the self? What might be some kind of tools or tactics or frameworks that you recommend for the kind of that person who's just, you know, really the service archetype?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I guess we'll just go kind of right to the heart of it, which I think is,
Mm,
I think very often that service archetype is the grown-up version of what was a childhood survival strategy. Very often, those of
mm,
us, I think that those of us who go into service professions like you're talking about, were
mm,
children and families who, the way we call it in the therapy world, we talk about parentified children, children who grew up in family systems that were stressed. And so then, we became the ones who sort of cared for the adults, and we cared for the adults in the hope that if they were okay, then they could have a little more capacity to care for us. And because it became the way that we knew to be effective, right? For those of us who grew up as kind of the parentified child, the caregiver in our family system, it was our first way that we knew ourselves as being powerful, as being potent, as having agency, was when we could help a parent feel better or take something off of our parent's plate. And then we got the praise or the reward of, you're so good, you're so helpful. And so it became this kind of self-perpetuating cycle and a survival strategy, because it kept the peace. Whatever role we take on in our family system growing up, the function is to keep the peace, to create some approximation of stability. And so that, I'm saying us because this was certainly me and my family system, that then we grow up and we seek a profession where we are rewarded again for the care that we're able to provide. And so I think one of the challenges is that so often our wounds and our gifts are next door neighbors, right? They're just right there on the same edge. And I think that can lead to perfectionism. I mean, the same fuel for ambition and excellent caregiving becomes the same fuel of burnout and perfectionism, and a need to be needed. Sort of like, who am I if there aren't people knocking at my door, needing me, needing my care, needing my wisdom, needing my support? Who am I then? So I think the deepest layer of the work is kind of getting into that core of who did I have to be back then? And how do I offer comfort and empathy to little me who had to be that way? And then grown up me gets to be this way. I get to step in and be helpful, but then I also get to step away. And the stepping away and the rest and the, sort of pleasure for the sake of pleasure, I get to have that. And that is restorative in the moment. And it also is extending love to the younger version of myself who never got to experience, that idea of rest and not, vigilantly looking around for what's the next shoe that's going to drop.
You're talking about patterns essentially. And if you're that person who's, kind of grown up in a home where you kind of needed to keep the peace, how do you, that's your childhood version, and you kind of carry that into the adult version. At what point do you recognize that, all right, this is no longer serving me? Or, at what point do you see that really start to impact relationships? And what's the process of kind of backing out of that, or how do you recreate a conversation and boundaries, when you're, say, in a marriage for 15 years, and this is just how you've always been? Yeah. How would you imagine approaching that conversation with yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is in some ways the most beautiful thing about a long-term marriage, is that we get to have front row seats to each other's evolution, And I mean, I think for the vast majority of us, we go into our intimate partnerships with a whole bunch of unfinished business. We tend to, I think it's, like this, I know some people, feel like we're drawn to people who are going to give us the chance to rework our old stuff. I don't even know. We don't even have to go there, because it's enough to just say we're going to bring our unfinished business into our marriages, our relationships, no matter who our partner is. And so you're right. It may very well be the case that in year one of the marriage, I was hyper vigilant around making sure that you had no need left unmet. I was really anchored around making sure that you were okay. But now, as I'm starting to look at my family of origin, some of my patterns, in year 10 of our relationship, I say to you, I don't know that this serves either one of us, for me to be so focused on you, accommodating you, making sure. So I'm going to try some practices of stepping back, of speaking up a bit more. And so, as I do that, it's gonna shake the system. It's going to feel different for you. But if you can kind of stay curious about the price that I've paid for, all this caregiving that I've
Mm.
provided, in all the ways in which my vigilance around caring for you perhaps has kept you from caring for yourself, has kept you from caring for me. That there's a
Mhm.
way in which if I start to change my part of the dance, who do you get to be now? Right? I'm
Mm.
not abandoning you. I'm not betraying you. I'm not breaching our contract. I'm saying there might be a different way of doing this that serves me better and that gives you a chance to show up in our relationship in ways that you can't possibly show up if I'm doing everything for both of us. So I think it's that. I think so often, this is the as we grow and evolve, I think it is destabilizing,
Mm.
but it's also an opportunity. So I want couples to hold on to both facets of it. And it doesn't mean that we did it wrong in year 1 or we sucked in year 1. It just means we're both growing and changing. And what if? What if we try it this way? What if I don't accommodate? What if I say, I don't know yet. I don't know if I'm a yes or a no. Let me pause for a minute and really see, because I know that my knee jerk reaction is just to go along with whatever you want because that's how I've always been. But
Mhm.
what if we slow down and I take a moment and really pause and really make sure that my yes is a yes?
Mm. Can you talk about energy of love and the energy of fear? Because I think those seem like drivers here. Like if we
Hmm.
have an energy of fear, we're much less likely to even acknowledge or consider our own needs inside a relationship. But if we're operating from an energy of love and trust, that's a totally different paradigm. So I'm just wondering kind of your take on that, and kind of how do you foster or create this energy of trust and love, and not just that knee jerk to kind of operate out of fear.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. This was something that I talked about in my TED talk, is this idea that there's,
Mm.
kind of two types of motivation, right? The two drivers, as you're saying, the energy of love, which is kind of trust in bounty, trust in enoughness, like really moving towards something, versus the energy of fear, which is moving away from something, like, sort of trying to avoid a more dreaded outcome, or fear and scarcity. One of the places this comes up, like I was working on this recently around when a couple goes through a breakup and there's a question of, like, should I be friends with my ex? And I think there are times where, like, if the energy of fear is in the driver's seat, it might be like, I have to be friends with my ex because I'm worried they're not going to be okay unless we're
Mhm.
friends. Or I have to be okay with my ex because I have to prove to everybody that I can handle it. That's the energy of fear, this like scarcity, this I have to
Mm.
avoid something that seems dreadful, my grief, their grief, other people's perceptions. Versus the energy of love, which may sound more like, I choose to be friends with my ex because I really appreciate the place they have in my life, and they are
Mhm.
more to me than the role they play or the relationship status we have. So I know that for me, the energy of fear kind of feels like tightness in my body when I'm choosing something from a place of fear. It feels
Mm.
tight, it feels urgent, it feels desperate. It feels like I have to, otherwise X, Y, or Z is going to happen. When I'm in the energy of love, it feels like I get to, I
Mm.
want to, like, it feels really like I feel like my whole sternum kind of opening and easing. And it's like, I get to have this. I get to choose this. I get to try this. It kind of has the
Mm.
energy of, I don't know how it's going to
Like
go. Let me
choice.
try it. Yeah, 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 yeah. So that's, it's kind of a big concept that helps us sort of anchor in a moment about what's the driver in this moment.
And you feel like a majority of the time we can choose love.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that we can. I think that we can. I think there is, and it's difficult when, when a moment is charged from things from the past. It's difficult when things
Mm.
feel really pressured. It's difficult when we're exhausted and depleted and, sort of our bodies are out of whack. It's difficult to feel like I don't even know what the heck my body feels like, much less, what I'm choosing. So, for sure.
Nice. So yeah, I think there's like an element of agency in all of this that
Mhm.
is a skill, would you say?
Mhm. Up to practice. It's a practice, right?
Yeah.
I think it is. And there's so many. think so many of us are on just autopilot from the way that we've been socialized, from the families
Yeah.
that we grow up in, and so there's like a peeling back of, okay, how do I move from the shoulds to the wants? And I, it's like this, I feel like in this conversation, we're like toggling between like the big picture stuff and the micro stuff. I
Mm,
know that the work that you do is so much about, right, the really tight time frame of
mm,
what's happening right now. And I love
yeah.
that. I love the idea of us having these like very tight feedback windows
Mm,
so that we can really start to feel, what does ease feel like in my body? What does
mm,
love feel like in my body? What does it feel like when I'm moving out of ease into tension and fear? Because that's,
mm,
that's the moment when we have to pause, like in a relationship, in a conversation with a couple, right? When I'm doing couples therapy, I'm tracking, how much are they in an energy of love? How much is curiosity in the driver's seat? How much is
mm.
empathy in the driver's seat? Versus when they shift into tension and fear. And I'm sure you'd have a way of looking at the physiology of that. What's spiking, what's
Mhm.
shifting, and
Yeah.
that is, and what the research shows is it's very hard for a couple to notice when they've crossed over, right? Because when we cross
Yeah.
over, that urgency does feel like, but I have to get this point across, and you have to understand me, and we have to figure this out right now. And
Yeah.
there's very little that has to get figured out right
Yeah.
now. And couples do so much better when they can recognize that they've crossed over and they're no longer seeing each other as on the same team. And that the best thing to do is
Mm,
lovingly and mindfully say, I love you too much to keep talking right now. I'm going to
mm,
pause. I'm going to go get some water. I'm going to go put
mm.
my feet in the grass and breathe for a little while.
I love that. Those are two excellent strategies, by the way. I know I feel like there's always this, uh, I think we feel like we always have to come to a resolution.
Right, right. Mm-hmm.
And I think once we kind of let go of that, it opens up space, I think, for curiosity and love and trust and some of these more productive emotions.
Yeah. Well, especially because John Gottman's research has found that a full 69% of the things that couples have conflict about cannot be solved because they have to do with personality differences, different
Yeah.
orientations to life, different worldviews. And certainly I'm thinking about
Yeah.
something that our son is 20, and he and I, had a just a stressful conversation a few days ago. And I know in that conversation, I felt such urgency to figure something out that is
Hmm.
absolutely not solvable. It is an ongoing tension that in our important relationships, we just continue to live with these ongoing sort of paradoxes and quandaries and mysteries that are not going to be solved, but they can be handled with more grace, more savvy, more recognizing, aha, here we go again. Okay. I love us too much to keep going. So I'm going to pause, step away, remember the bigger picture here, and try to
Mm,
figure out if there's a different way of talking with you about this,
mm,
because it is not going to be solved or done. It's going to be something we have to carry perhaps differently.
yeah. I heard you say once that dating is like collecting data. And
Mhm.
of course, as someone who works with copious amounts of data, I love that little analogy. But yeah, tell us more about dating. I feel
Mhm.
like there's a lot of challenges when a relationship ends, kind of starting back up. What do you see as kind of essential, before starting to date again? I always feel like I heard you also say that, you don't need to be perfectly healed before you start
Mhm.
dating again. And I feel like that's like very much a lot of what is coming through on social media and just in kind of, just things that we hear, that you kind of have to go through this journey of self-healing and you have to be perfectly healed before you start dating again. I'd love to get your take on that
Yeah,
and just
right.
this concept of data collection.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, well, for somebody who spends a lot of time working with couples in long-term relationships, I'm equally as fascinated by the beginnings and endings of relationships,
Mm,
because I think they matter so much. And we are,
yeah.
the bigger picture is that very few of us stay forever in our first love story. Most
Yeah.
of us are going to have several love stories. And so
Right.
ending well and beginning well are just very, very, very important skills, and
Mm,
skills that I don't think we spend I know there's just not a lot of opportunities to learn about how do you end well, how do you integrate a loss, how do you know when you're ready to date again, how do
Mm,
you, how do you begin again after a
mm,
heartbreak, after a loss, after even your own behavior, right? Like I think so much there are times that we behave in our relationships in ways that we are not proud of. So how do
mm,
we forgive ourselves and then step back in? It's not
yeah,
always, having been heartbroken. It also is perhaps being the one who has behaved in a subpar way, in a way that we
yeah,
don't love. How do we gently and lovingly kind of hold ourselves to account?
yeah,
So yes, and so what I love about, and as somebody who's been 25 years in a marriage, I have
wow.
not dated for a very, very long time, but I am here for the people who are dating because there's something uniquely challenging about modern dating, and something where there is just a tremendous need for support and advocacy. And
Mm,
you were making the point that a lot of what's out there, there's a lot of money to be made, to say it bluntly,
yeah,
a lot of money to be made by selling people the 5 steps for this, or the 5 tricks for this, or the way to get this, and so for me, dating comes back again to relational self-awareness, which is viewing the process of dating as you said, data collection, a
mm,
chance to learn about ourselves, a chance to watch ourselves in conversation, to notice how attraction feels inside of our bodies, to notice what a yes feels like, to notice what a no feels like, to get curious about, is my no truly based on I don't see this person as compatible with me, or is my
mm,
no based on a fear? Like, and what's the fear? Like a fear of stepping in, a fear of becoming vulnerable, a fear of trusting. So I think there's a lot for people to be noticing and attending to as they date, and that I think people who are dating really deserve to have processes for introspection, for looking inward, because there's a lot of noise. I think oftentimes people who
mm,
are single have a whole audience of people who love them very much, their families, their friends, who want to hear all of the juicy details about their dating lives,
right.
and then maybe express strong opinions that are driven by their own
Experiences.
perspectives, their own, yeah.
Mm,
And so
mm-hmm,
I'm very invested in people who are dating, having
mm,
processes for slowing down and noticing
mm-hmm,
what's happening inside of themselves.
yeah. Gosh, I love that. That kind of interoception and that just somatic awareness. Like I think I think it's so important to be connected to your body,
Hmm.
and I feel like that that's also a skill, and I think it's something you have to practice, and you have to actually take time, it seems, to remove yourself from the noise, from
Hmm.
the phone, from to really think about how you feel and have your own point of view about your own
Yeah.
life. Like I just feel like that's just not, yeah, it's not something that I think we create enough space for ourselves, and as a result we end up kind of getting into situations that might not be optimal.
Yeah. What would be the kinds of things that you would want somebody to be paying attention to, like in the kind of in the moment, like let's say on a first date, like what would be the kinds of, like how would your, like through your lens, what would somebody be noticing or attending to that's happening inside of them as they go through, for example, a first date, that would be a cue that, this
Mm.
is interesting. You may want to go for a second date versus, oh, this is seeming like maybe step away.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like baseline kind of like slight elevation in heart rate, would be expected, that you've got this like nervousness, but this excitement. And I think you've said it so many times. I mean, I think you've said it 5 times in the span of our conversation, this notion of curiosity.
Mm,
Do you feel genuinely curious about this other person? And do you have this desire to listen? And do you do you want to kind of go to your phone? Like, like if you're
hmm.
kind of just able to really be fully present, I think that that's an awesome cue and kind of a filter. But I guess that's kind of what I'm saying, is that I think that capacity for presence and attention is something that we're not great at. And I think that's a
Yeah.
huge failing in a lot of well, I'd love for
Hmm.
you to tell me. I think that's a huge failing in a lot of
Hmm.
relationships, is this inability to just really be present and
Present.
attend to what's happening.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of that is facilitated by, just the little micro things that we're doing, across the day. Are we getting this sufficient sleep and consistent sleep? Are we putting, good things in our body? Are we, managing our stress proactively throughout the day? Are we walking on the grass in our bare feet? I think like a lot of these little daily practices, like, are going to impact whether or not we kind of show up in this conversation with someone else in a way where we can actually be truly curious. So, yeah, that'd be my
I think that
perspective.
makes, like, I love what you're saying, because it's not like I think that somebody can't, like, I'm imagining if somebody has been sort of going through the motions all day, and, sort of like a like a head, like a little floating head on a balloon string,
Yeah.
like sort of floating around, not connected, not grounded, and they show up on their date and they feel kind of like bored, flat, disconnected, disengaged. And then the story they attach to that is, this person isn't interesting. This person isn't a good fit.
Yeah,
There's a miss there, isn't there?
I think
Because
so.
the only thing that we can control is our side of the street, how we
Hmm.
show up. And so I love that idea of grounding practices that start long before you've shown up for that day, that become just
Yeah.
part of how you live inside of your body, because then you do know with greater certainty that when
Mm.
you show up for a date, you've controlled the one variable you can control, which is your own, like, you've set your compass in a really clear way,
Yeah.
so that then the data that comes in really is the data that emerges from the dynamic between the two of you, and is therefore more trustworthy
Yeah.
than the
It's a
fact that
cleaner data set.
it's a clean, we love a clean data set. we
Social
love
psychologists. Yeah.
we love a clean data set. We love
Mm,
controlling the variables we can control. Yeah.
sure
But
do.
I think that is
Yeah.
so, like, if I've been running around all day and negative self-talk and da da da, I'm going to show
Mm.
up on a date and I'm going to assume that person is as critical of me as I've been of me,
You're going to project that.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's such a vital, message. I think there's probably
Mm.
lots of connections that sort of die on the vine, because people are, I think, showing up, it's easy to show
Mm.
up on a date and either feel like it's an audition, like either
Hmm.
I'm performing for you, or to
Hmm.
feel like it's an interview, like I'm assessing the degree to which you are worthy of me. And the truth
Hmm.
is, a date is really a conversation. Like, it's an interplay. It's sort of a back and forth
Mm.
to kind of feel out what's the love story here? What's the possible connection here? And it's for both people to show up with presence and curiosity to see what
Mm.
might be able to emerge here. But none of that is easy, right? Like, I
No.
think it's easy to, talk about that. I think that it is true, it is real what we're saying, and it is not at all easy. And it's not easy.
No.
I think that, dating apps make it more difficult, right? This idea, there's sort of this whole overall vibe of, just expendability and low accountability. And so I think, people's sense of feeling jaded and self-protective and a bit cynical, like, those are real, like, those make sense. Those are not feelings that people are pulling out of thin air.
In your practice, do you find a lot of folks use kind of these dating apps to is they pretty popular, I guess?
Yes, for sure. For
Okay.
sure. Yes. They are, I mean, they are wildly popular. And, I try really hard to be neither like pro nor anti dating apps.
Yeah.
But the thing that I am really clear on is that they are a tool. Like, they are
Mm.
your tool for you to use. I think what's difficult is that when you look at the history of dating apps, like Tinder just turned
Mhm.
10 recently, like it's just
Wow.
going into it. Yeah. So it's not been that long in the history of humankind that people have used, it's been for generations, people have used intermediaries, right? There's always been a matchmaker in the village, or, want ads in a newspaper. But to seek love via an app is pretty
Mm.
radically different.
Yeah.
It's both an extension of, and a total, like, right hand turn.
There's no
But it's,
evolutionary roots there
you
for
know,
us to
no, no. But also the fact that even the dating apps, what I've learned recently from some folks who study this, is that it is a business model now in a way that it wasn't in the beginning. I mean, I'm sure there's always been a profit driven aspect of it, of
Mhm.
course, but there's a way in which now dating apps have become gamified, and what they're really selling, or what they're really having you buy, is your attention, right? So this idea of kind of
Totally.
staying hungry, staying dissatisfied,
Yeah.
coming back for more. So I think I want people to at least know that, so that then they've got that feeling of agency. Like, I am here to use this app
Mm-hmm.
versus the other way around. The app is just a means to an end. You get in, you find a potential connection, and then you get out and you go and do the human to human thing of sitting across the table or going for a walk or going to a museum or whatever it is you're going to do. But you get into the somatic, lived,
Yeah.
embodied practice as soon as possible, for sure.
Oh, that's such a, I think, important principle as we think about all sorts of sources of technology. Like you
Hmm.
just, yeah, I think having before you go into it, like those apps can own you very, very quickly. That's
Yeah.
they're designed to do just that. So you kind of have to go in with so much intention. I feel like that's what I hear you saying, is that there's
Yes.
got to be this really, you have to have a framework, you have to have an understanding of what it's doing to you, how you're going to use it, so you can just go in with just full awareness.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we're talking about it in terms of dating app, but I think I've got some of those challenges around my own social media use, and and for sure that is a
Yeah,
huge problem across the board for all of us right now, to be, yeah, to just
yeah,
be understanding the impact of this very new way of living. This is not, we're all kind of in the emerging stages of figuring out how do we want to interface with our technology.
yeah. I think on that note, how do you feel like we're learning about relationships and intimacy? Just thinking about, how do you kind of see this as we fast forward and we're in a relationship? How do you kind of resolve this tension of just kind of having your own virtual reality in spaces that you
Hmm.
go to that are delivering huge amounts of value, that are impacting your brain and your dopamine system and your reward system and your motivation? And how do you think about that in your practice, and just, as a scientist and,
Yeah.
yeah, a researcher?
One of my really big ahas lately around this was, I teach undergraduate students at Northwestern, and across the board in conversations with them, the message that they give is that they know in their bones that they need time and space away from their phones, and that there's a connection between having grown up, because this, college students today are obviously ones who have had smartphones, from the beginning. There's been this, like, kind of just whatever, this generation of college students has for sure been with technology since the very beginning. And one of the connections that they have been making lately in conversations with me is that they feel like they have a very low threshold, a very low frustration tolerance in relationships, that they will very
Mm,
quickly feel like, this friend is annoying, I'm going to go find a different friend. This person
mm,
I'm starting to date is bugging me, I'm out. Like, the first sign of trouble, that there's not a
mm,
lot of, like, kind of bandwidth or capacity to persist in a kind of frustrating or ambiguous relational dynamic. And I love that they can say that. I love that they get
mm,
that they're noticing themselves cutting and running sooner than
mm,
they think they should, because noticing it is the first step towards tweaking it, right? Like, nothing can be changed until it's been named and recognized. So I love that connection,
mm,
even as my heart breaks around it, right? Even as I feel kind of concern and worry about, like, what's the impact of that? How do we undo it? I love that they're noticing that there's a connection
mm,
there, because I do think that helps. And then it is all that, like, relationship skill building stuff. Bringing up to a friend, I didn't love it when you did that. I didn't love when you canceled plans. That's a really
mm,
big trend, right? Or just, kind of consequence, I think, of technology, is it's really easy to bail on plans, because everything kind of feels tenuous and tentative, and everyone knows that everyone's looking for what might be a better use of time, what might be a
mm,
more enticing thing. And so, knowing that, again, we can honor the commitments that we make. We can bring it up to our friends. I didn't like it when you didn't honor the commitment that you made. And that those become the micro practices for changing course, like witnessing ourselves being brave, witnessing
mm.
ourselves being uncomfortable, bringing something up that's not easy to bring up. Like, those are the building blocks. Those are the little footholds that build on each other.
Yeah, I think you kind of keep coming back to this, like, notion of self-awareness, that seems to be a thread.
Hmm.
And I would say that is, would you say that's one of the most important building blocks of a healthy relationship?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. We turn our attention inward, not as some
Mm.
sort of like esoteric, like learning about ourselves for the sake of learning. Not that there's anything wrong about learning about ourselves for the sake of learning about ourselves, but we do it by turning our attention inward and noticing what our growing edges are.
Mm.
That's how we then challenge ourselves to do things a little bit differently. And what research has shown is that when I do something a bit differently in our relationship, the change, my commitment is really cemented when I have the chance to watch you respond to me differently. When
Mm.
I approach you, whatever, in a curious way instead of an accusatory way. When I try that, when I commit myself, okay, so I'm going to approach Kristen with this concern I have, and I'm going to say,
Mm.
hey, Kristen, when you did X in situation Y, I felt
Mm.
Z. I'm going to try that
Mm.
skill of bringing things up in a really gentle way, what
Mhm.
researchers call a soft startup. When I
Mm.
try that, that's a change that I made, right? I'm trying a soft startup with you.
Mm.
But my change is really cemented when I watch you, I watch your shoulders drop, I watch a little smile reach your face, and you say, okay, tell me more. Like that's when my change is cemented because I feel the effectiveness of my tweak, right? I made this
Yeah.
change to try to be a bit gentler and bringing something up with you. And it's in watching you respond to me differently that it's like, oh, this shit works. Like
Yeah, I love
this
that.
worked. I can bring something, I can call for something different. You're less
Yeah.
defensive than you otherwise would be. You can
Mm.
hang in there a bit longer with me when I bring things up differently with you.
And what would you say, if you're in a relationship and kind of constantly having, whether it's like a tension and, maybe the other person's getting defensive, for example, and it's likely how I'm starting the conversation is the reason why that person's getting defensive. At what point, and I know there's a gazillion different ways you could take this, but what do you see as being like kind of the biggest problem in trying to kind of solve an issue in a relationship?
Hmm.
Is it how the conversation started? Like what do you think is kind of the root cause of like not being able to come to a solution?
Well, how it starts really, really does matter. How it
Yeah.
starts matters. And I think that people can kind of have blinders on around that, and not have enough awareness of how much the
Mm.
beginning matters, how much the approach matters. I
Yeah.
think that's very common. Like when somebody says, my partner is so defensive. My partner is just
Mhm.
so defensive. The first question is, talk to me about how you're bringing something up because
Right.
the approach matters.
Yeah.
It's really hard because defensiveness sucks. Defensiveness feels awful. It feels like you
Yeah,
are
it's so
just, I mean,
hard.
you're bumping up against a brick wall. So,
Mhm.
and that is awful and it is painful. But until and unless you have done some examination of how
Mhm.
you are introducing a topic, I think that can feel challenging because that is, especially when it is a woman frustrated with a defensive man, which is
Mhm.
usually how this goes. It's very hard to ask her to hold up a mirror and check in with herself about how she's bringing something up because she's like, great, you're asking me to do more emotional labor. Now, not only am I the one bringing up the issue and dealing with his defensiveness,
Mm.
but you're also asking me to be mindful of how I bring things up. So
Right.
again, it's not easy, it's not fair, it's not right,
Mm.
but it is effective, right?
Mm.
Part of it, a lot of how the conversation goes is how it starts determines in
Mm.
part how it goes. And there are times when somebody absolutely might be doing the softest startup in the world, leading with curiosity,
Mhm.
seeding the positive, being really gentle, and they're still going to get defensiveness from a partner. And that is that now we have another problem on our hands, right? And so now the conversation becomes, you know, can you help me understand more about what blocks
Right.
you from being able
Right.
to have this feedback, or how might you be able to hear this in a way like I
Mhm.
can't take my concern off the table.
Right.
Me taking my concern off the table doesn't help either of us because the concern is still going to be there whether or not you and I are talking about it. But I want to talk about it in a way that you can hear, so let's figure it out together. if we're going for a walk, it's easier to have the conversation. You know, if we're
Yeah.
how do we set I think also couples,
Setting. Yeah.
don't spend enough time kind of focusing on the context, the setting, time
Mm.
of day, that all that stuff matters. It's
When I
not
have more energy,
yeah,
when,
it's
yeah.
not a free for all. It's not like just because I have something on my mind, I get to talk about it wherever, whenever, however. That the
Mhm.
context matters, the setting matters, the frame
Mhm.
matters.
Yeah. Where you're at in your circadian rhythm, as someone who studies circadian rhythm.
That's right. Okay, yeah. How do we do that? What do you think? Like, what's the prime? How do you prime it? Like, what are the
Yeah.
things that the data would say about
Yeah.
the right timing, the right context?
I would say probably like late afternoon when you're, after that kind of little trowel, like after lunch, we typically feel a little bit more sleepier, not quite as primed, I think, to have like a real big conversation. So I say we start to kind of get, peak back up. Our temperature starts rising again around 3 o'clock. So I'd say 3 or 4 could be like a really good time. And then I would say definitely, kind of in that morning time frame where you're kind of really, obviously you just had a nice big rest. So in theory, you're a bit more rested, you're kind of cognitively more primed, between the hours of kind of 9 and 11. So that would also be a really good time, I think, to have a conversation. I think a lot of times folks have it at night,
Yes.
and that's when, most individuals are really depleted, right? They've spent the whole day, working and grinding, getting the kids to soccer and to hockey and to, and you're trying to make sure everyone gets enough protein and, making, and then finally you're like, okay, let's have a conversation. You're like, I can't
just
make
want to
sense of anything.
watch a show and go to sleep.
I want to,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think being mindful of timing, being time aware, I think is really important for these big conversations.
Okay, so I feel like I work a lot with couples on the value of like daytime dates, morning dates. I think so often our dates are like Saturday
Totally.
evening or evening. So I'm putting these
Hmm.
two things together because now you're giving me the science to back up what feels intuitive to me. Is this I love the idea of a couple having like a brunch or a breakfast or a morning walk together and trying to have
Yeah.
some relationship dialogue then.
Yeah.
And the story often is like I think we can if we want to, we can find an excuse for any time of the day or any setting. Like we shouldn't talk
Mm.
now because we're getting along so well. We shouldn't talk now because we're not getting along well. We shouldn't talk now
Right.
because we're tired. We shouldn't talk now because we just woke up. So you can always find an excuse for avoiding
Hmm.
relationship conversation. But I like this idea of listen, we're going to have this really important conversation, just a piece of it, because most important
Yeah.
conversations are ongoing and couples are going to be having them for decades. But
Yeah.
we're gonna just dip in to this important conversation on our morning
Hmm.
walk because
Yeah.
Kristen's research has shown we're fresh, circadian rhythms are lined up, we're rocking and rolling here, and that there's like an intentionality and a care and a way of saying we're going to put the wind at our backs. We're going to
Yeah.
stack the deck in our favor by being
Yeah.
intentional about this.
I love that. And, I think, we're, as I was telling you, physiological monitoring tool, and we basically tell you kind of what your capacity is mentally, physically, and emotionally. So we use metrics like heart rate variability and heart rate. And we have this beautiful algorithm that kind of synthesizes all this information and gives you kind of a daily marker of kind of how primed you are to take on the day. And I would go so far to say that, if you have to have this really hard conversation, you want to make sure your partner isn't depleted, that they don't have massive, and
Yeah.
maybe that makes it, there's never this great time. But I think kind of aligning physiology is important. We kind of talked earlier about just this mirroring, right? Like what you bring to the conversation, the energy that you bring to the conversation. We've done a lot of research with Dr. Amy Edmondson looking at the relationship between psychological safety, which, as you know, is so important in relationships, but this is looking at workplace psychological safety, but looking at sleep deprivation in leaders and the degree to which their direct reports feel psychologically safe. So the more sleep deprivation, the less psychologically safe the direct reports felt. And of course, psychological safety, how can I bring my true self
Yeah.
to this conversation, to this relationship? Like, how safe do I feel in
Yeah.
this relationship? So trying to have a really hard conversation when your partner is carrying a lot of sleep debt or you're carrying a lot of sleep debt, it's going to be that much harder just because of what we emote. Like, just even if I feel fine, I think I feel
Yeah.
fine, like I'm going to hold my face completely different in the presence of sleep debt versus not. So it's, I think, when we consider just all the context around healthy relationships, I think it kind of goes back to what we started in the beginning is, are we taking care of ourselves first? Are we getting the sleep that we need? Are we eating healthy? Are we hydrating? Like, just some of these like micro kind of little daily things that we can do to kind of set ourselves up to be able to navigate the challenges
Oh.
of being in relationships.
And I mean, everything you just said is so counter in the best possible way, so counter to the highly romanticized sort of Disney driven narrative that
Totally.
if we're right for each other, we should be able to have these conversations. We
Mm,
should be able to, like if you were the one, then you should be able to talk to me no matter how you're, all this kind of like mythology that gets
yeah.
going. I really appreciate the way in which you are talking to us about, the fact that if that like foundational stuff isn't
Mm,
there, how could it go
yeah.
well? How could we not? And we are, especially in intimate partnership, we're so sensitive to each other,
Mm,
right? I have times where I'm sitting with a couple, and to me, both of their faces seem, neutral and open, but they know each other so darn well
yeah.
that, when her eyebrow goes like this,
Yeah.
her wife knows long before I do that shit's about to go sideways. You know what I mean? Like it's just
Yeah.
like that,
Hmm.
those little cues. And what you're saying is that those cues, like things like sleep, of course,
Hmm.
dictate that. Even if you
Yeah.
want to be present, you
Yeah.
can't override your body, or you
It's
can't
hard.
override your body for very long.
It's hard.
Mm.
Dr. Solomon, I'm so excited to talk about your book. Love every day. I want to finish this beautiful conversation with just tell us a little bit about the book and your kind of reasons for writing it and what can people expect.
Yeah, this has been a really fun project for me. So this is my third book, and it's different. This is a daily book. It's
Mm.
365 micro practices. So we've been talking a lot, about sort of
Wow.
the micro, the daily, the small, and that matters. It's not always about grand, sweeping aha moments or
Hmm.
large gestures. A lot of self care and intimate partnership exists in the micro, in the
Mm.
granular, in the small. And so I wanted to create a book that really honored the kind of daily practices of self care and of relational care. So this is a book of, you can start it whenever, whatever day the book arrives in your hands, you open that to that page and you read the message and the lesson. There's very often micro practices,
Mm.
little sentences to write from, journal prompts. So it's every day you just get a little dose, a little reset, a little adjustment, something to kind of guide you in that day of how you want to show up for yourself and for your relationship. So it's a year's worth of relationship education and relational self-awareness tools and practices, and it's a really beautiful, I'm so delighted with how beautiful the book
Uh,
is, how good it feels in one's hands, that this is hard, it's hard work, and so let's at least do our hard work in a beautiful way.
I've seen the digital copy, but I cannot wait to get my hands
Yeah,
on just the real thing.
yeah, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about sex.
Hmm.
So I want to talk about it from the context of someone who's dating and maybe who's been out of, been in a relationship for a long time and is now kind of going into the kind of this new world. How does a person think about it in that context? And then, just some of the challenges that folks face kind of as, across the lifespan and across a longer term relationship in terms of sex and how important is it in a relationship?
Yeah, I mean that's a huge, it's a huge and beautiful and important question that we each get to ask ourselves throughout our whole lives, right? I think that the thing with sex is that it's a behavior, or it's a set of
Hmm.
behaviors, it's a thing that we do, solo or with a partner or with partners. And it also is a portal, a gateway into some
Mm,
of the most essential questions of who we are. So everything we've been talking
mm,
about in this conversation plays out in the bedroom. It's
mm,
so that any given sexual experience is so much more than just something that we do to get off or get our partner off. It is,
mm,
it's a practice. It
mm.
becomes a practice. It becomes a way of asking and answering a whole set of questions of, what do I
Right.
mean to you? What do you mean to me? Am I okay? Are you okay?
Mm.
And it's something, I think our culture is so messed up around sex, to
Yeah.
say it bluntly. It's either like taboo or titillation. It's like these
Yeah.
extremes of don't or have to. And it's why I think so many of us need a journey of reclamation, of understanding what
Mm.
is my story of my sexuality,
Mhm.
because we're told so many different things from our culture about who we
Right.
have to be or who we shouldn't be, or in what context it's okay and what context it's sinful and all of this stuff. And
Mm.
so there's a way that all of us need a chance to quiet the noise around
Mm.
us and really kind of tell our own story of our sexuality, which is the story of our bodies. It's the story
Mhm.
of pleasure. It's a story of permission. It's a
Mhm.
story of vulnerability. And when somebody is dating, right, things like, the third date rule, that you should be having sex by the third date, all this stuff, it is just such baloney. I think people who are
Right.
dating really deserve to have their sexuality be something that they get to explore when and how they want to. And that's hard
Mhm.
because at least in the US, sex education is so completely inadequate. So none of us grow
It's
up
really
knowing
bad.
how to talk about
Mhm.
sex. And so talking about sex with a new
Right.
partner, it's really challenging. And so lots of us need tools and scripts and
Mhm.
practices for, like, how do I even start to talk to a new partner about
Yeah.
sex? But the key question is, by what means will I know when I'm ready, when it's going to feel
Mm.
really good for me? And it's not about somebody else's definition of you should be having it by this point or not having it
Mm.
by this point. It really is by what are the cues inside of my own body? What am I feeling with this
Yeah.
person, where I know that I want to begin to layer in some
Mhm.
erotic exploration? So those are some thoughts on something that we could talk about for 6 more hours.
I know.
It's
I
such a
know.
fascinating topic. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think like sexual satisfaction, there's so many components that facilitate that.
Hmm.
Would you say, I think kind of self-exploration, I think we kind of go back to, do you understand your own body? Do you
Yeah.
understand what feels good to you? I guess, what is your take on just the importance of self-exploration? Like, kind of thinking of it
Hmm.
like as a single player game for a little while until like you
Yes.
really, like get comfortable with kind of who you are and yeah, what feels good. So you can actually, kind of be more responsive to cues and guide, an
Mm.
intimate relationship. I guess I wonder, well, I just feel like that's so critical, and that's definitely not talked about in sexual education. But I feel like that is kind of really foundational. Like you have to understand yourself and your own body. And yeah, so what's your take? How do you think? How do you help individuals and kind of couples think about that perspective?
Well, it's, the place I was going to go first, as you were saying, that was talking about the orgasm gap. And for women who have,
Hmm.
especially for women who have sex with men, or vulva bodied people who have
Hmm.
sex with, penis bodied people,
Hmm.
there's an orgasm gap. The chances of her having an orgasm are so much smaller than the chances of him having an orgasm. And that has to do with, penetrative sex being held above all
Right.
other
It's like,
behaviors. That is
sure.
not the most, but so in that way, self-exploration for a vulva body person, for a woman, it
Hmm.
really is, right, understanding first of all, what are my parts, right? So many
Hmm.
of us don't even understand, like, what our clitoris is, where it is, what the function is, what feels good, all of that.
Do
um
you have your little
my
your
little
kind of stuffed animal or
clitoris, right?
stuffed little clitoris?
Where
Like,
is she?
yeah.
She's never far from me. She's over there.
We are in video if you want to grab her
That's right. Okay,
so
I'll show
people
you.
can see it.
Oh, she's so
People
cute.
need to see it. I think this is a public service announcement right now for all the folks on the call who might not be aware of what this little thing is.
Isn't it
Yeah,
so? It's from Etsy.
there
Some
it
gal.
is.
Let's shout her out. The internal clitoris puppet. Sexliberated.com. Yep.
I'm going to be so pissed if Jack edits this out.
No, don't edit it out, Jack. Leave it in. Leave the clitoris in. Yeah. It is. And I think I love the feminist sex toy companies like Dame. And there's all these like wonderful, Dipsia is a new like erotic audio. Like there's so many wonderful like
Yeah.
sex tech and women
Hmm.
founded, like this, just sort of like this movement towards being
Hmm.
unapologetic about women's pleasure is
Hmm.
vital.
Hmm.
And for those who've been socialized in the masculine, for men, for penis body people, they need that journey towards understanding their bodies just as much,
Hmm.
potentially, if not more, because especially younger men have grown up in an era of 24/7 access to porn. And I am not anti-porn, but I am anti-porn as a sex education tool. And I am anti the idea that the only way a man knows his own body is by masturbating to porn. So when I teach my college students, I am explicit about like having practices where you are just with your own, like eyes closed or
your
eyes
imagination.
open, but just your own imagination, just really because you deserve it. Not because porn is wrong, but just because you deserve to notice how your body, to know your entire body as a receiver and giver of pleasure. It's so much more than just about your penis and what it's doing or not doing. It's about the entire embodied experience. So yes, your point about self-exploration, self-knowledge, like understanding how you track, like that's the foundation then for building the kind of improvisational back and forth that is sex.
And I think I haven't done this research to be clear, but I think there's probably a direct relationship between an underdeveloped imagination and the sexual pleasure of a partner. Like I think there's a linear relationship there.
That's right. Strong positive correlation.
That's right. I think imagination is really important. And you can't really develop that if you're using all these external stimuli, to kind of facilitate that. Like I think it's something that you have to kind of practice and experience. And
and again, not from a moralistic standpoint, but just from a place of exactly as you're saying, just from a place of like deservingness. Like you deserve to be able to tap into something that's as big and wide as your own imagination, as your own curiosity, as your own capacity, for sure.
Right. Well, you have just been an absolute dream to talk to. This is so much fun, and I cannot wait for your book to be out into the world.
Thank you to Dr. Alexandra Solomon for joining the show to discuss her newest book, Love Every Day, and offering her insights on relationships. If you enjoyed this episode of the Whoop Podcast, please leave a rating or review. Please subscribe to the Whoop Podcast. You can check us out on social at Whoop, at Will Ahmed. If you have a question you want to see answered on the podcast, email us, podcast@whoop.com. Call us, 508-443-4952. and we'll answer your questions on a future episode. If you're thinking about joining Whoop, you can visit our website, sign up for a 30-day free trial membership, and take the first step to unlocking your own best performance today. New members can use the code WILL, W-I-L-L, to get a $60 credit on Whoop accessories. And that's a wrap. Thank you all for listening. We'll catch you next week on the Whoop Podcast. As always, stay healthy and stay in the green.